Thank you everyone for coming. I'm welcomed here by Angie Babbitt from Monarch Watch, and I'm Kathleen from the library. This is a webinar version of our Zoom meetings, so you are anonymous. However, if you have questions, we have the raise hand option, and you can also put questions in the chat here. And I'm gonna go ahead and turn over the Zoom to our presenter, Angie from Monarch Watch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm, as she said, Angie Babbitt. I am hailing from Lawrence, Kansas, where I work at Monarch Watch. It is a nonprofit organization, but we also are part of the university. So I am going to go ahead and start sharing my screen with you. And tonight I'm going to be discussing monarch butterflies, the biology of monarchs, their amazing migration, and what might be happening to cause the monarch population to decline, and then what you could do to, as a single individual or family group to help monarchs in their plight. So I'm going to go ahead and start with, this is our logo. Chip Taylor is the founder and director of Monarch Watch. He started Monarch Watch in 1992. At the time, he was working on Africanized honeybees, which are often thought of as the killer bees. At the time, his interest in that was very strong, but the interest in the science community wasn't quite so strong, and so he needed to switch gears and decided to start working with monarch butterflies. One of the things that he did was he assumed the role of running the Eastern tagging program. The Eastern tagging program was actually started in the 1940s by a Canadian, Dr. Fred Urquhart, and his wife, Nora. In January of 1976, the people who had originally found the colonies in Mexico on a big search. So that would be Ken Brugger and his partner, Catalina Trail. They directed Fred Urquhart to the overwintering sites in Mexico. At the time, there was a National Geographic crew along with them. And when he was sitting on a rock or a tree stump in the overwintering sites, he looked down and saw what appeared to be a tag on one of the monarchs on the ground. And it turned out it was one of the tags he had distributed to a school in Minnesota. So he was able to trace that tag back to this school teacher in Minnesota. And as you can see on the wing in his hand, there is a tag on the forewing, on the leading edge of the forewing. Our tagging program, if you may have participated in it, you'll be familiar with our circular tags that are no longer placed on that leading edge of forewing. You can see girl is releasing one, and there's a tag on the lower wing, and it's on the underside of the wing. And this is a way that we have decided to do it so that it decreases the effect of the tags on their ability to fly. It also holds onto the tag a little bit better in that position. This group of children has just released a bunch of butterflies with tags, and you can actually see the tag on the wing of the one in the air. It's something that children who have manual dexterity can participate in. And so it's a really great way for kids to connect with this insect. This is an example of one of the tag recoveries. This particular butterfly was found alive and was photographed, and the photograph showed the actual tag number, and you can see this says UGP 451. And that particular butterfly, 461, sorry, that particular butterfly was released by someone in Ontario, Canada, and found alive by someone in Mexico. It was not quite yet all the way done with this journey. Um, and we were able to make this map showing how far it had traveled. So one of the things that has happened most recently is that Dr. Taylor has started to write papers based on the research that he's doing with the tagging study. There have been millions of tags placed on butterflies, and he's using that data to write papers that are helping us better understand the migration. So this is the general overview of the two migrations that happen in North America. You can see on the west side of the Rocky Mountains, there is an entirely different migration pattern. The butterflies that move in the west are going to the California coastline for the most part, rather than to Mexico. There's a Southwest Monarch study that's out of Arizona showing that about 50% of the butterflies that are coming out of Arizona in the wintertime are going south, and 50% are going to California. And that's a tagging study being done there. But I'm going to focus on the eastern migration. And over the years, Dr. Taylor has developed a theory that the migration is actually a 4-part migration. I'm going to show this map again, so we'll revisit this after I go over to the parts of the migration. But here is the first part. Right now, we're starting to see the first part of the migration that moves monarchs northward from Mexico. So in late February to early April, we start to see the monarchs getting active in the overwintering sites. And in the second week of March, they really start to move into Texas. And those butterflies that are returning to Texas are starting to mate and lay eggs. And they'll do that for a couple of egg laying cycles, and then eventually they will die. By May, most of those butterflies have passed away. The second migration is when in mid to late April, the offspring from that returning migration, so the offspring of the ones that were in Mexico, are adults, and they become mature and start to both migrate north and reproduce. But by early June, all of that directional flight ceases. So by this time, we will have seen them move up into their summer breeding grounds. And that might be as far north as southern Canada. And so we consider that to be the colonization of the United States and Canada. In the third part of the migration, some but not all of the monarchs start to move southwest, and that is in the middle of the summer. We have seen these monarchs moving in directional movements towards Georgia and Texas, and by the third week of August, that movement seems to be over. And then the fourth migration is the biggest one. The biggest one is when all of the butterflies that are in Canada and the United States on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains start to become actively moving in the direction of their overwintering sites in Mexico. So this happens at different latitudes, and it moves southward. The butterflies in that migration are non-reproductive. So that means that they haven't actually developed reproductive organs fully yet. And this is really important because it helps them to overwinter in the sites in Mexico without using a lot of energy for those reproductive organs. So here's this migratory map again. In the area that you are viewing this from, in the Orion Township Public Library, you can see that you're just a little bit north of the Corn Belt, but it's also very important breeding grounds in the summertime for monarch butterflies. So this is where in the summer you're going to want to have resources for monarchs, including milkweed and nectar sources. And the overwintering grounds where the monarchs are departing right now as we speak is that very lowest star that you can see on that. It's an incredibly long journey, and it is estimated the farthest monarchs travel is about 3,000 miles. So Orion Public Library is at 42.8 degrees north latitude, and I've put a big circle there. The migration in the fall is dependent on your latitude. So, and if you are interested in participating in the tagging program or just learning more about this, I've put our website address there, monarchwatch.org/tagging. So there's a chart on that website, and this is where you would see the latitude approximately of your location, where you would see monarchs starting to move in mid-September, early-ish mid-September, and then the end of the migration would be around September 15th through 17th, something like that. But this peak in monarch abundance is when you really see a lot of monarchs moving through your area. They might be seen roosting in trees, and I'll show you some pictures of that. And also, if you happen to see monarchs at any time of the year, you can report them to a website called Journey North. And this is a screenshot that I took of the peak migration in 2020. As you can see in your area, people were seeing monarchs roosting in trees. And all of the dots that you see on the screen have a photograph associated with them if there's a white center on that dot. So this is just another screenshot of, well, it's actually a photo that was taken off of that site. And this is the type of information that people can report on Journey North. You know, this person is observing that every year their backyard is filled with monarchs. And so they're able to report this kind of thing on an annual basis. And here's another photograph of monarchs that were found in Minnesota. And they estimate about how many and how long they were there. And Journey North might actually contact people to double check to make sure that the sightings were valid. They do put the information on their website in real time. So it might only take a couple of days for every sighting to go on the website. But if you're in Mexico, you would see this if you were in an airplane flying over the overwintering sites. So those monarchs that are roosting on their way south, they eventually get to Mexico and they also roost in the trees there. All of those trees have that rusty orange color are actually covered in monarch butterflies. And the perimeter line that you see around there is where they're estimating about the approximate size of that population. The information that we get from Mexico about population size is based on the ground observations of monarchs, where they actually measure the perimeter of the area that monarchs are in the OML forests there. So in December of 2020, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was tasked with the job of putting forth a decision about whether or not the monarch should be listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And their determination was that it was warranted that the monarch be listed, but unfortunately, because of higher priority listing organisms, it was precluded by those other priorities. So what that means is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service just doesn't have the resources right now to also list the monarch butterfly. But basically what this means, and which is good for monarch butterflies, is that its status is going to continually be reviewed year after year until it is no longer a candidate for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And that just basically means that we need to continue to be vigilant and make sure that we're conserving monarch butterflies. Shortly after that report came out in December, we also received news that the monarch population in Mexico had continued to decline from last year. And you can see in the middle of this, there's some green text that says between the years of 1994, which is the first date we have this kind of data, and 2020, which is the most recent, the average area that was covered in the forest was 5.43 hectares. But between the years of 2004 here and 2020 was only 3.34 hectares. So we can just see that there's a steady downward trend of monarch population. And unfortunately, on the West Coast, we're seeing an even more dire situation there. In the 2020, they have an annual Thanksgiving count, and in the Thanksgiving count of 2020, there were only 1,914 monarchs observed in those sites, as opposed to millions of monarchs in 1997. So it was 1.2 million. So we're really seeing a lot of effects of different things going on in California. So I'm going to cover a little bit about monarch biology. The first thing that you should know about monarchs is that they can only consume milkweed plants as a caterpillar. The females will search out the milkweed plants and taste them with their feet. They can also smell milkweed in the air with their antennae. This particular year, 2015, we had a super warm spring, and monarchs were coming up a little bit too far north and laying eggs in large amounts on the milkweed plants. So we can see that the changes in our climate are affecting the monarch's ability to find food in the springtime. So this actually was posted to Journey North as the first sighting of eggs in Kansas that year. So the other thing that we need to know about monarchs is that the milkweed toxins that are in the plants also help protect them throughout their life. And many people are probably familiar with the warning coloration that monarchs exhibit. That flashy orange and black wing is meant to ward off predators. And because of that, monarchs also have a lot of mimics. Almost every orange and black butterfly that you see is in some way mimicking the warning coloration of monarch butterflies. The most popular of that would be the viceroy butterfly. And there are a lot of other butterflies that eat poisonous plants. For example, the pipe vine swallowtail eats up the poisonous pipe vine plant. And there are a lot of other butterflies that mimic that toxic butterfly as well. So this is what happens when a monarch butterfly is eaten by a bird. And this is an iconic image that was taken during a study by Dr. Lincoln Brower. And what happened was the bird immediately vomited after it consumed the butterfly. The butterflies they don't survive this, obviously, but the birds do. And so a bird who eats a monarch butterfly will remember that warning coloration of the orange and black and avoid orange and black butterflies in the future. Just like if a human were to eat something that gave them food poisoning, and they want to avoid that particular type of food in the future. So another thing that I touched on a little bit earlier was that monarchs are either migratory or reproductive. Now, I did say that there are 4 reproductive cycles. So, there are 4 different migrations. I'm really only talking right now about the main 4th migration when I'm saying they're either migratory or reproductive. The movement that happens up in the United States and Canada, the northward movement and a little bit of the southern movement, those are reproductive monarchs. But that main 4th migration where they actually end up all the way in Mexico, those butterflies live for 6 to 8 months because they conserve so much energy by being non-reproductive. Monarchs are considered tropical butterflies. And one of the things that we know about them is that they can't survive a freeze. So that's one of the reasons why they go to Mexico. They're heading south You would think that, you think of Mexico and you think of the Cancun area and things like that, but these butterflies are heading to a mountainous region that is higher elevation, and it's quite cool there. So they use those mountains to keep their temperature levels at a good temperature for their metabolism. So in the summertime, adult butterflies need lots of nectar. And if you're planting a garden and you want to have monarch butterflies, plant a few milkweed plants, but plant a lot more nectar sources. And try to stagger your bloom times for those nectar sources throughout the times that insects are active. And this is an example here of the New England aster, which is found across most of North America, which happens to also be the host plant of another butterfly that's fairly common. A lot of times when you're using native host plants, native nectar sources, they are also host plants for other butterflies. So one of the things that we like to encourage people to do is to kind of get an idea of what those kinds of butterflies are that you might be planting for their larval stages, and become accustomed to a little bit of herbivory on your plants in your garden. So I'm going to go into why monarchs are declining, and I want to we're going to look at the big picture, and while I'm doing this, think about how humans fit into this big picture. And if you are so inclined to try to do something to help monarch butterflies, how do you personally fit into this? What kinds of things can you maybe add to your life or change about your life that could help monarch butterflies out? So these are some of the reasons that monarch butterflies are having a little bit of trouble. Monarchs are, they're basically what we call cold-blooded, or they're reliant on the external temperature of their environment for their metabolism. So because of that, changes in temperature really affect these animals. So any changes in the climate, unusual weather patterns, things like that are really going to impact monarchs. Another thing is the intensive agriculture that we've seen. So this map that we have over here on the right part of the screen is from the Nature Conservancy, and it shows you the original tallgrass prairie ecosystem, which is actually the largest most endangered ecosystem in the world. As you can see, the darker areas are what is left of the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. And my home state of Kansas, it has quite a lot of that prairie ecosystem intact still. But the majority of it has been lost, and that would have all been monarch habitat. Another thing that has happened in the last 15, 20 years is that we've introduced herbicide tolerant crops to the landscape, much of which is in this tallgrass prairie area. And part of that includes the pesticides that they're using on those crops. But when I was talking about pesticide use, pesticides cover a lot of things. And one of the things that we've seen is the use of pesticides to control mosquito populations have also impacted monarch butterflies. And we also are seeing land use changing in the United States. We're also seeing some degradation of the overwintering habitats in Mexico. So some of the things that are secondary to all of those are, we're seeing reduced amounts of land that are available to monarchs, and the land that is left behind is being managed in ways that isn't conducive to monarch habitat. So a lot of them are getting mowed. And these fragments are getting smaller, and we're losing a lot of diversity of our native flora and fauna. The native tallgrass prairie system, as many of you may know, is a really diverse ecosystem. And one of the things that is often overlooked is the root system of the tallgrass prairie. This example over here is what we would see in our lawns. The turf grass that's used in lawns has a very, very short root system. The roots of tallgrass prairie plants are up to 15 feet long and deep into the soil. And that is one way that tall grass prairie actually helps to reduce the amount of carbon that's in the air. It actually gets put into the soil. And because they're perennial plants, that carbon is maintained in the soil. You can also see in Mexico, you can see where the overwintering sites have been degraded. In this picture here, you can see right up against where those monarchs are roosting in the trees. We have a lot of deforestation happening. And when the forests in Mexico are degraded, it also degrades the habitat for the monarchs on a micro level. So they're more exposed to rain and wind and snow and temperature extremes because those trees act as a buffer. The trees actually act as a buffer to each other as well. When we saw this particular problem occur in March of 2016, a lot of the trees that were affected by this, and a lot of the monarchs that were affected by this, there was kind of a dual effect where the monarchs were cold and the wind was blowing and the snow was bad, but the fact that there had been deforestation in that area made more trees fall down than normally would have fallen. This is a map of the United States, obviously, and it's showing the rate of temperature increase between May and September. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but there is a measurable increase in temperature. And one good thing you can see is that the least amount of change is occurring in the areas where monarchs depend on their habitat on the eastern side of the United States. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening in California. As you can see, that's where the highest rates of change are occurring. And that might be contributing greatly to the demise of monarchs in the California overwintering sites. What is causing the increase is our transportation energy use, agricultural and deforestation and other land uses. So as you can see, we're looking at a picture here where we have agriculture is contributing to the increased amount of CO2. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the agricultural land is being used for and how that also increases our use of transportation energy. But when we start to see these rises in temperatures, we also see effects of reproductive systems in insects, including monarchs. It changes the breeding conditions for the butterflies. It can decrease the amount of nectar resources if there are droughts. Migration weather is important. Of course, they need to have prevailing winds going in the right direction. And then we also see changes in overwintering weather. Right now, they're seeing a lot of drought in the overwintering sites and hotter temperatures, which is causing the monarchs to become active sooner. And one of the things that we've talked a lot about at Monarch Watch is how the introduction of the herbicide tolerant corn really was spawned a lot by the ethanol production in the United States. And we have really had a surge in the amount of crop corn that has been used for ethanol production. So in this table, you can see that I did the math at the bottom. 32.3 million acres were converted to herbicide tolerant crops. And basically what's happening here is that those crops are being treated with glyphosate. And glyphosate use increases prior to the herbicide tolerant crops. This is all in US Geological Survey information here. You can see the increase in glyphosate use substantially changing the landscape in the United States. And this is a more current graph here. prior to the use of glyphosate, you would see lots of milkweed plants in the cornfields and in the soybean fields. And that corn is being used primarily for feeding livestock and going into ethanol production. So remember that about 30% of all of our carbon dioxide use, our 30% of our carbon dioxide emissions is from agriculture and from transportation. So a lot of the agriculture is also being used to go into transportation. So I like to think about, like, how do I fit into this picture? I drive a car and I put gasoline in my car that has ethanol in it. I also eat meat. So I sometimes eat cows that are fed corn. Um, and I like to think about, like, what are ways that I can change my patterns of behavior that might actually help to decrease this problem that we're having. This here is a soy field. And so you're seeing the same kind of pattern. Back in the background of that particular image, you can see where there are actually milkweeds growing way back there. Those milkweeds, we found in a study done by Karen Oberhauser and others at the University of Wisconsin. She discovered that the production of caterpillars in the soy and cornfields was actually higher than it was in pastures and CRP land and other places. We think that maybe it's because there are extra resources added to the soil, extra nutrients added to the soil that allowed the monarchs to be a little healthier and more robust. But the production of monarchs in these fields was pretty high compared to other places. So we lost all of that with the introduction of herbicide tolerant crops. Basically, the crops can be dosed with glyphosate and everything will die except for the soybeans. That means that there are less resources available to monarchs if they were relying on the milkweed that was in the field. Here's another graphic showing what soybeans are used for. So I again ask myself, like, how do I consume soy without maybe even knowing it? If I'm eating chickens, if I'm eating beef or pork, some of that is going into animal feed. Also, a lot of biofuels are being produced with soybeans. So like diesel trucks that are bringing my food to my plate are basically contributing to the issue as well. Recently, we were alerted to a problem that happened in Fargo, North Dakota and Moorhead, Minnesota. There was an aerial spray for mosquitoes that affected roosting monarchs in the area. And the Fargo Moorhead vector control people are on top of this. They're trying to figure out ways to change it so that this doesn't happen in the future. But it brings to light some of the problems that we might be seeing with our controlling things that we consider pests. Of course, the West Nile virus is a problem in the Fargo Moorhead area. We don't advocate for reduced protection from those types of issues. But we do also recognize that there need to be educational programs and other types of personal protection that are advocated for when we're talking about mosquito control. So what can you do? Where do you see yourself in the big picture of this? I wouldn't expect everyone who's listening to this webinar to just, take on every single one of these issues and say, I'm going to become a vegetarian. I'm going to stop driving my car. I'm going to plant all the milkweed and nectar sources. I think that we can all just do one or two things, though. I myself have a little bit of a yard, and I'm going to start reducing the amount of grass that I plant and increasing the amount of native plants that are in my yard. I have a list here. So if you have the ability to take a screenshot, I'm not going to read through this, but these are some ideas of things that you might be able to do. For example, engaging in sustainable monarch tourism in Mexico. I just want to make sure that you guys are familiar with some of the ideas that have come out of Mexico. These ideas came from the butterflies and their people who are helping out with the Monarch Reserve at Cerro Pelon. And they are really smart about what they need. So we are really wanting to support them. And this is another screen. I don't like screens with lots of text on them, but if you have the ability to kind of look this over in the future, get some ideas about what you might be able to do, and utilize some of these ideas for what you can do. Like, for example, can you support a pollinator garden somewhere, or start a book club that explores native gardening? Maybe you could just eat less meat or drive less. The really important citizen science programs that are going on in the country are advertised really well through Monarch Joint Venture. Monarch Joint Venture is a partnership organization, and Monarch Watch is a partner of Monarch Joint Venture. There are a lot of different citizen science projects, and if you are involved in monarchs on a personal level, if you're raising monarchs, if you want to help record when you see monarchs, these are a lot of different ways that you can help out. And community science is really important, and it really does actually lead to actual papers being written. This is the Monarch Way Station #1 at the University of Kansas. When I'm fortunate enough to be at the university, when I'm working there, this is where I get to go have lunch. And it's a really amazing experience, because when I'm sitting in this garden, I'm surrounded by birds and crickets and other organisms that normally aren't seen anywhere else on campus. There's a mockingbird that comes by every year and sings. We have bluebirds that come through here. When you start feeding the caterpillars in your environment, you start to feed other things as well. And what we're really hoping that people do is not just try to conserve monarch butterflies, but to conserve their entire ecosystem, which sometimes means that monarchs are going to get eaten by other things. But that also just means that they're part of a healthy ecosystem. So we're going to talk a little bit about gardening. I know not everybody has the ability to garden, but if you need good plant lists, go to Pollinator Partnership, and they have these. All you have to do is put your zip code in, and it will direct you to the correct plant list for you. The Xerces Society also has published plant lists as well. We're going to talk a little bit about specific milkweed plants that you can grow for monarch butterflies. So the common milkweed is one that everyone might have seen at some point or another. It grows on roadsides. It's pretty tolerant to disturbance. And I understand that the library might be handing out some free samples of common milkweed. It's a great nectar source for a lot of different butterflies. It does get a little bit tall, so if you put it in your garden, you're going to want to put it in a place where it's not going to overshadow something else. And it also does tend to send out a lot of rhizomes underground. When I first planted this in my garden, I was surprised to see that it didn't bloom the first year, but the second year there were plants popping up all over the place, and I knew it hadn't bloomed. So the plants that were coming up from the roots, and some of them were as far as 10 feet away from the original plant. So this is something you want to be aware of when you're gardening with this particular plant. It can, as I said, get pretty tall. And this is another picture of the Monarch Way Station #1 at the University of Kansas. This is the distribution of it, just so that you know it's totally local to your area and native. The other one that's really popular with gardeners because it isn't pushy and it doesn't pop up unexpectedly is the swamp milkweed. And it's also popular with people who like to water a little bit in their garden. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's website says it has cultivar behavior. So it oftentimes acts like a garden plant rather than a wild native. Both of the plants that I've shown you so far require full sun. Swamp milkweed has a beautiful flower. And this is its normal distribution. So it's also found in your area. And the third one that is pretty popular and is often found in nurseries is butterfly weed. Butterfly weed is pretty popular because it's one of the only really showy flowers with a bright orange. The insects love it. You'll see bees on it. You want to make sure that it's in full sun. It won't do well in shade at all. And it's got this beautiful bright orange flower, and the pods are pretty unique as well. And it also has a pretty wide distribution in the eastern United States. So that concludes my talk. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Great. Thank you so much, Angie. I just had one question, and then I'll open it up to any of the attendees if they want to use the raise hand option or put any questions in the chat. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your background?
Sure, absolutely. And if you need me to go back to any of the slides, I can do that as well. I have a master's degree in biology from a local state university here in Kansas. And prior to that, I was at the University of Kansas, where I am now, for my undergraduate. And during that time, I worked with a woman named Dr. Diane Dubinsky, who is now at Iowa State. She was interested in understanding a little bit more about the relationships between different types of land treatments and the populations of butterflies that are found within them. And so as an undergraduate, I did an honors thesis on butterfly populations in mowed versus burned versus grazed land. And I also did a comparison of different patch sizes. So there's a theory called island biogeography, where, you know, even if it's not a true island, if it's a patch of habitat, it's kind of, it can be treated like an island. So organisms can be tracked to and from these island patches. At the University of Kansas, they own some land where they have created patches. And so they're doing a large island biogeography study. And so I actually published my first paper and only paper through that honors thesis, doing that study, determining what were the differences in the different patch sizes and the butterfly populations found within them. My job here at Monarch Watch is primarily working with the public to make sure that their questions are answered about monarchs and milkweed. I also sell milkweed on our website, and we have a couple of grants for free milkweed. So if there's anyone listening who is associated with a school or a nonprofit or a library that wants to get any free plants from us, we have a free milkweed grant. And it's on our main website. All you have to do is click on the button at the top of the page that says free milkweed. And that's at monarchwatch.org.
Great, thank you. We do have a question. I'm not sure if this is monarch specific, but Laura asked, I also understand that bird baths with rocks in the middle are also good for the garden. Is that right?
So specifically when it comes to butterflies and bird baths with rocks in them, there are a lot of butterflies that do a behavior called puddling. And you'll also see bees and wasps oftentimes using that kind of um, structure to get water. What's really interesting about monarchs is they only really do any kind of puddling behavior when they're in Mexico. If you put out rocks and like a little bubbler maybe with water in it, you won't see monarchs landing on that and using it for water. They actually only get most of their water from the flowers that they get nectar from, except when they're in Mexico. And when they're there, they spend a lot of time up in the trees, but the only time they really move is to go down to the ground, and there are seeps on the ground where the water's coming up, and they'll go down there and they'll get minerals and water from the seeps that are on the ground there.
All right, thank you. And I think there's a follow-up question. Also, given treated corn has proven detrimental to the monarch population, is it the correct assumption you should buy organic when possible?
So there are two different ways that corn is treated. One of them is that the seeds are actually coated with a type of pesticide. And that usually is something we call neonicotinoid, also referred to as neonic. We at Monarch Watch, we are really concerned about the use of this particular type of pesticide, because what it does is it travels through the system of the plant and it becomes a part of the plant's system. If anything that eats that plant is an insect, it will be affected by that pesticide. So monarchs, for example, don't eat corn, right? But the problem is that when treated corn goes on the ground, the neonics that are in the corn, the treated seed, can actually get into the waterways. And there have been studies that have been done where they have shown that neonicotinoids are being found in milkweed plants that are nowhere near treated corn. So this stuff is traveling quite a distance, and it isn't clear how far it can go or how long it lasts in the environment. And it affects not only just the herbivores that eat the plants, but it also can affect anything that is getting nectar off of the plants. So it's traveling from the original corn site to other plants in the environment, and it's affecting the insect populations in those environments. So that's specifically an insecticide. Okay. There are other ways that corn is treated. So the other one is glyphosate, which is a herbicide. So the herbicides that are being put on these crops are you're only able to use them on herbicide tolerant crops. And those are crops that have specifically been bred so that if you treat them with the herbicide, the crop itself is not affected by the herbicide. And the only way you can reach that is through genetic engineering, because the herbicides actually impact all plant biology, not just corn biology, but they impact every. So the herbicides have been, they were actually invented first, and then what they did was they grew a bunch of corn in the lab, and they kept treating the corn with the herbicide over and over and over again until eventually somehow one of them was genetically able to withstand this this treatment. I'm going to step back for just a second. They weren't treating the corn, they were actually treating a bacteria with the herbicide. And then they took the genes from the bacteria and inserted those genes in the genetic code of the corn. So now you're able to grow corn that is tolerant to the herbicide, just like the bacteria were tolerant to the herbicide. It's a complicated and expensive procedure. So, so what has happened over the years is that there have been a lot of things occurring in the environment where these herbicides are being used so much that we're starting to see weeds become resistant, because weeds are able to reproduce so quickly. And we're not talking about milkweeds, because milkweeds are perennial that doesn't reproduce quickly. We're talking about annual weeds that probably don't even belong here. They've become resistant to the herbicide treatments. So what do the companies do? They go back to the drawing board, and then they find more genes in the bacteria that are resistant to other pesticides. So now they've got 2,4-D, and they've got dicamba, and they've got this, what they do is they stack these genes in the corn genome, and they're able to create a corn that is not just resistant to glyphosate, but also 2,4-D and dicamba. And now they can rotate the pesticides that they're using, and it's less likely to develop a super weed. The problem with all of this is that it's ecologically, it's a disaster, right? So we're talking about large pieces of land that only have one type of plant on them. And that one type of plant is either corn or soybean that's intended to be used for production of ethanol, biofuels, and fed to our livestock. Livestock, by the way, that wouldn't normally eat those things, right? So the cows would normally be out in a field eating grass. So the whole system is a little bit iffy. And then when you add into the fact that it's taking an entire landscape and turning it into a monoculture that is not usable by any sort of wildlife whatsoever, including monarch butterflies. We're seeing a collapse of not just monarch butterflies, but a lot of other organisms like songbirds, nesting songbirds, and other insect populations that are disappearing. Dr. Karen Oberhauser at the University of Wisconsin is always talking about how when she was a child, and when I was a child too, we would be driving in the country and we would hit insects on our our cars would hit the insects, and they would be all over our windshield. And that just doesn't happen very often anymore. When you're done with a long trip, you don't have to scrape the insects off your windshield. So what's happening? A lot of it is because of these chemicals that we're seeing in the environment.
All right, thank you so much. We have time maybe for one more quick question. So if anyone else has a question, if they want to put something in the chat or raise hand feature, if not, that's fine too. And I will share that everyone that participated, there's 11 of you here. You will get a packet of milkweed seeds that you can pick up at the library starting tomorrow afternoon. And then this presentation is recorded. So if you have other people that wanted to attend this but couldn't, this will be recorded and uploaded to our social media accounts and YouTube. And I'm going to share that also with you, Angie.
Great.
So we'll just wait a second to see if there's any other questions. I don't
know if I really talked. I talked a lot about Laura's question, but one of the things she's talking about is buying organic. I don't know if I can answer that so much. It really depends on what organic means, because the organic label oftentimes doesn't mean what we think it does. So I would say try your best to buy local and ask the people who are growing the food the questions that you want to know the answers to. If you're buying foods that are coming from Brazil or other locations far and wide, you don't have the opportunity to ask. But if you buy local, you can ask the farmer, what is going on with your animal, or what are you feeding them? If you can find grass-fed beef that's finished with corn, that's better than corn-fed beef. Confined animal feeding lots are also a big thing now, where we have animals that are fed lots of corn and they're in confined spaces. We might want to rethink how we're doing that. I personally haven't been able to completely divest myself from all of these things. I don't think it's really a possibility, but I do really try my best to think about, um, when I'm buying food, do I know where it comes from? And am I lowering my impact when I'm purchasing things? A lot of the food that we have is transported long distances. That's a lot of energy to be spending on getting our food, and food prices are honestly, uh, because of our agricultural system the way it is now, food prices are oftentimes much lower than they should be, um, because the corn and the soy industry is subsidized. So the subsidized um, farming, oftentimes, if your crop fails because you've put crops in an area where they didn't necessarily belong, because you want to increase your yields, because you've got these great new herbicide tolerant crops. No fault of the farmer, really. They're being pressured to create these new types of farming techniques. That those types of things are actually fueling this system that keeps our crops artificially low price. So if your crop fails, you're not really losing much. And so, we just need to. These are the just types of questions that we need to keep asking ourselves. I would like to say that I could come in here and do a talk about monarch butterflies, and it's all like butterflies and flowers. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is a decline in the amount of butterflies that we have in our environment. And so I just encourage people to just kind of think about where they fit in that big picture as much as they can.
All right, thank you so much. We're just about out of time, so I'm just going to pitch one more program that everyone here in attendance might be interested in, as we are starting a seed library at the library, and the kickoff for that is April 11th. So those of you that enjoyed this program, you may also enjoy that. And again, you can pick up your milkweed seed packets at the library starting tomorrow afternoon. And thank you so much, Angie.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.